With profound gratitude, I would like to thank Mayor Booker for the opportunity to speak to you in behalf of 6 million Jews, 20 million Russians, more than 1 million mentally ill, thousands upon thousands of Christians, and many others whose number perhaps will never be known. It happened 65 years ago. World War II ended with the promise of 1,000 years of great prosperity, wealth, and virtual control over the fate of all nations around the world. Hitler, an Austrian-born egomaniac, plunged the world in the greatest human tragedy known to man, with a total of 8 million people tortured, starved, humiliated, gassed, and burned to ashes. Fortunately, as a result of the American intervention, his dream ended after 12 years, committing suicide in a bunker in Berlin in the company of his girlfriend, Eva Braun. My story begins in the year 1940, when Hitler gave Transylvania from the Romanian to the Hungarian in exchange for all the Jews to be deported to Germany. Our lives continued fairly normally till April 1944, when the German SS troops arrived. Within a few days, all Jews had to place a Jewish star on the left side of their chest and turn in all their valuable possessions. Next, all men between the ages of 15 and 25 were to report to a designated area outside of the city limits. After a few days, about 600 of us marched to another town about 50 miles away. Soon other groups arrived and our numbers increased to about 1,500. In order to destroy our self-image, they marched us to a location near the bank of a river and made us pick up as many rocks as we could carry and take them about 5 miles away to another location. Then we had to drop these rocks in a pile and start the whole process all over again. About 15 hours a day for the next several days. One morning, we were told that we were to march west. A group of Hungarian soldiers showed up. In addition to the yellow star, they gave us a yellow armband to be worn on our left arm. You cannot imagine how the state of affairs destroyed us mentally and physically. This eventually became a death march, which lasted almost 6 months, moving towards the west. Towards the end, corpses were lining the road. We buried them as we went along. Before I continue my own story, may I describe to you the tragic sequence of events my family had to go through. A few days after my departure, around April 20th, 1944, all Jewish people of my city, more than 3,000, women, children, had to march to a brick factory outside of the city limits. Each was allowed to carry a bundle small enough to be carried in one hand. The area was surrounded with barbed wire, guarded by SS. Conditions became intolerable. People were crying. Nobody knew what to expect. The older ones were collapsing from hunger. After about 5 days, long trains with boxcars began to arrive. Ramps were set up, and each boxcar was loaded with so many people that there was standing room only. As the long journey toward nothingness began, a state of bottomless despair set in. The train traveled slowly with long halts. Through the small openings, they saw names of unknown cities disappear behind them. They were suffering from heat, hunger, thirst. At every stop, everyone screamed for water. Nobody paid any attention. The journey turned out to be a nightmare without end. After 5 days of hell, the train arrived at the Auschwitz concentration camp. The doors opened, a ramp was pushed against the door. The train was met by hundreds of SS soldiers. They asked everyone to drop the bundles in a pile and line up. They were asked how old, healthy or sick. Based on the answer, they were sent left or right. In the end, the men who seemed in good health were loaded in trucks. The others had to march in front of Dr. Mengele, called the Angel of Death. The old and weak ones were sent to the gas chamber. The young had to pass under a horizontal bar. Those who were too small were sent immediately to the gas chamber. Some children approached the bar on their tiptoes, hoping that they will be sent with those who were destined to slave labor. As soon as the SS noticed the tiptoeing youngsters, they shot them in front of their parents. My father had 4 brothers. One of them had a few amputated many years before. Mengele sent him to the gas chamber. The other 4 brothers, not knowing what direction were they going, followed him. Nobody saw them ever again. About 85% of the whole transport from my hometown was exterminated within 2 days. My 2 sisters and my mother were sent to the barracks. My mother managed to stay alive for about 6 months with the help of my 2 sisters. One day during the selection, which took place every morning, the SS noticed some damaged skin and sent my mother to be gassed and cremated. The 2 sisters managed to stay alive until the Russians approached. The women were loaded in boxcars and sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. The crematories were working day and night. Luckily, before my 2 sisters were killed, the Russians arrived. After several weeks of recovery, they were just skin and bones. They were repatriated to our hometown, but I was waiting for them. Before I tell you how the story ended, may I continue my endless struggle to stay alive. When those of us still in the death march arrived at the Austrian border, the SS had a welcome party waiting for us. They formed 2 lines, 20 SS on each side, facing one another. We had to pass through this line while they were beating us mercilessly till we reached the other end. Austrian border, thousands of survivors were housed in an abandoned stable. Conditions were deplorable. They woke us up around midnight, giving us a bowl of rotten cabbage soup. Before sunrise, we were marched towards to the Austrian border to build 5-foot-deep trenches in which the German army was to meet the advancing Russians. Each one of us had to dig a certain length of trench. Those who could not finish were shot on the spot. I missed one page. Oh, yes. I soon realized that to survive this madness was virtually impossible. When the Russians began to get closer, they marched us further west. One night, in the middle of nowhere, I ran away into the adjacent forest and kept walking west, stopping at farms where I found refuge, claiming to be a Hungarian refugee. For several months, I was able to evade capture. By the late spring, I was arrested and placed in one of the transports destined to a concentration camp named Dachau, where my arrival was very similar to the one my family went through in Auschwitz. Luckily, Germany was now attacked both from the east by the Russians and by the Allied forces from the west. The country by now was in a great disarray. The American Air Force employed a so-called carpet bombing. Hundreds of bombers in formation released their bombs simultaneously, devastating German cities. One night, the bombing was so intense that the city of Munich was a pile of rubble. Thousands of people were buried under the collapsed buildings. They needed help so badly that they selected truckloads of prisoners from the concentration camp, including myself, to dig out the dead. I was assigned near the railroad station. In one of the trains, there were some Hungarian soldiers on sick leave. With more luck than wit, I managed to get a Hungarian uniform and walked away unnoticed. The journey back east was a very dangerous task, but I was lucky to reach the city of Graz on the Austrian border. Because of my fluent German, I was able to get around till I learned the existence of a military unit housed in a vacated hospital, where the so-called Sonderkommando, you might have heard of them. These were intellectuals who volunteered with one sole purpose: to kill. They followed the German army behind the front, and every community they occupied, they picked up people who were against the Germans, took them outside of the towns, made them dig huge trenches, and shot them one by one. These people numbered about several 100,000, and they were trained in this converted hospital. I went to the motor pool and asked if they could use an auto mechanic. What did I know about auto mechanics? Before I knew it, I became employed, lived with these murderers till one night I heard gunfire. I knew that the Russian army was approaching. I quickly got up, got dressed, grabbed a motorcycle from a motor pool, and I drove towards the front. Soon I encountered heavy gunfire. While thousands of Germans were fleeing the advancing Russians, I quickly drove away from the highway, dumped the motorcycle, and found refuge at a farm where I was hiding for the next few days. The war was now over, and I went back to Graz. Unfortunately, I got rounded up with all the fleeing Germans, with the murderers, with the SS, and was put into a Russian prison camp. Now, can you imagine, after what I went through, to be a prisoner in a Russian prison camp? With the help of some Jewish freedom fighters, I managed to escape and eventually got back home. But there was no home to go to. The neighbors occupied our home. I found some friends with whom I stayed. A few weeks, my two sisters came back. I stayed long enough till both got married. And then I started going west. In the meantime, the Iron Curtain has descended, and it was virtually impossible to cross the many borders to reach the American zone in Germany. But by now, I was an expert to pretend that I was someone else. After a number of weeks, I reached the American zone. For the next 2 years, I studied engineering at the University of Munich. On April 17, 1948, exactly 4 years from the day I was taken by the German SS, I arrived in this blessed United States. One morning, I received a letter from the President. I could not believe my eyes. How did the President know that I was here? To my great surprise, I was asked to report to Fort Dix for military service. Eventually, I was stationed in El Paso, Texas. After a year of service, I was transferred to active reserve for 5 years. I became a master sergeant. Hitler, after years of service during the First World War, he became a corporal. And he managed to convince 80 million Germans to be actively and inactively supporting his dream to create 45 extermination camps around Germany. Having spent 2 years in Munich, I didn't meet one single person who heard about Dachau. The burning flesh, the smell was spreading miles and miles away. Then nobody raised one word. Nobody knew anything what was going on. They could have stopped Hitler in 1933, but indifference helped him achieve to create an army that was determined to conquer the world. At the time I was transferred, I had to sign up for 5 years of active reserve in New York City. And while there, I met a beautiful 19-year-old girl. And we got married on December 21st, 1952. We have 2 children, 8 grandchildren, all of them residents of this beautiful state of New Jersey. If I may, I would like to impose upon your indulgence and say a few words to these wonderful students who are participating in this opportunity to learn something about the past to make sure that never ever happens again. As you will know, history repeats itself. All you have to do is read the most incredible stories about Kosovo, Rwanda, Bosnia, Nigeria, the Congo, and so many other countries where innocent people are slaughtered. It is your generation's responsibility to rebuke racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, discrimination. Albert Einstein, the greatest mind of the century, said the world can be an evil place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do absolutely nothing. My best wishes to all of you for a more peaceful and tolerant world. Thank you very much.